Back in the medieval world, no one handed you a house. If you wanted shelter, you built it yourself, or you froze. There were no fancy tools, no building crews, and certainly no construction loans. Just raw determination, your own two hands. And whatever nature offered, it wasn't fast, it wasn't easy, and it definitely wasn't glamorous. But somehow, ordinary folks made it happen. This is what it truly meant to build a home from scratch. Picking a location for your medieval dream. Home wasn't about convenience or curb appeal. You didn't scroll through listings or meet with real estate agents. In fact, most people didn't own land at all. Nearly all property belonged to powerful landlords or the church. If you were lucky, you got permission to build. If you weren't, you built anyway and hoped no one noticed or at least didn't. Care permission didn't come with perks. Wealthy landowners weren't known for generosity. If they stopped by, it wasn't with bread and salt to welcome you, it was to collect rent. That's why people had to be smart when choosing where to settle. Forest edges were ideal, offering easy access to timber and firewood. A nearby stream meant water for drinking, cooking, and maybe a rare bath. And yes, baths were rare. In many areas, brave souls resorted to clearing forest land illegally. They chopped trees, tilled soil, and built homes on patches they carved out for themselves. It was risky. Getting caught could mean heavy fines. But sometimes, if a local lord saw improvements on his land, he'd let you stay and just tax you instead. There were no zoning laws, building permits, or formal city planning. Priorities were purely practical. Would the land flood when it rained? Was there enough flat space for a home? Were there swarms of biting insects? And most importantly, could you survive there through winter? Interestingly, entire villages often shifted locations over the course of centuries. This wasn't due to grand planning, but because people gradually rebuilt closer to more reliable resources. The ideal spot needed three key things: access to clean water, nearby timber, and solid ground that wouldn't turn into a swamp at the first rainstorm. If you found all three, you didn't wait, you claimed it. That patch of earth became home, faster than you could say labor dues. Of course, choosing your plot was just step one. No one delivered planks to your door. Free shipping didn't exist. Free meant you carried everything yourself. Most homes were tiny, just a single room, around 15 by 20 feet, but even that required days, even weeks, of gathering materials. With the spot staked out and marked, the real work was only beginning. A well-chosen location could save your life when winter came, but it wouldn't keep the rain out, or the cold, or the wolves. For that, you needed more than hope. You needed walls, a roof, a fire, and a community willing to help you build from the ground up. Once the land was chosen, it was time to build. But in a world without hardware stores or delivery trucks, materials didn't just show up. You had to go find them. Forests were the closest thing to a supply depot, and wood was the lifeblood of medieval construction. Still, getting it wasn't easy. Cutting trees wasn't as simple as walking into the woods and swinging an axe. Forest access was tightly controlled. Peasants could usually collect dead branches for firewood, but chopping down live trees was another matter. That required permission from the local landholder, and if you skipped the paperwork, there were consequences. Medieval forest laws were strict. In some regions, being caught stealing timber meant losing more than just your axe. Records show people losing hands, being fined heavily, or worse. Even with permission, collecting timber was hard, dangerous work. The tools were basic. An axe was a prized possession, often passed from parent to child. For splitting logs, people used iron or wooden wedges and heavy mallets. No chainsaws, no pulleys, just patience, strength, and blisters. Timing mattered too. Freshly cut green wood bent more easily, which was useful for shaping curves, but it also dried unevenly and cracked. Dry wood was sturdier but far more difficult to cut. Smartest builders harvested in winter when the sap was low and then let the logs dry out toward season before using them. That took months, sometimes an entire year. Different parts of a house needed different kinds of wood. Oak was the strongest and ideal for the frame. Some oak-built houses from the Middle Ages still stand today, more than 500 years later. For walls, lighter and more flexible woods like hazel, willow, or young ash were used. These could be woven or bent as needed. Then came the hardest part, getting it all home. Logs are heavy. Medieval roads weren't much more than muddy paths that turned into bogs whenever it rained. There were no wagons for most peasants, no carts or oxen, just your back and whatever help you could get. Dragging logs through sticky mud for miles wasn't just back-breaking, it was dangerous. Wild animals, like wolves and bears, roamed forests, and bandits knew you were hauling valuable resources. That made timber collection both exhausting and risky. To stay safe, people went in groups. Timber gathering became a kind of community event. Everyone pitched in: friends, neighbors, even children. Strength in numbers helped ward off danger and made lifting easier. After weeks of cutting, splitting, drying, and dragging, you'd finally have a decent pile of wood near your chosen site. But even with timber ready, that was only one piece of the puzzle. Timing was critical. Work had to match the seasons. Winter was for harvesting. Spring and summer were for building. Rain could ruin materials before you even started. A bad decision could cost the entire effort. Still, gathering your own building supplies, with nothing but hand tools and human willpower, laid the foundation for everything that followed. Timber wasn't just a material. It was the frame, the shelter, the backbone of life itself. When the pile was ready, and the weather was right, it was finally time to turn raw wood into a home. With timber stacked and ready, it was time for the most dramatic phase: raising the frame. In medieval villages, this moment transformed building into a community-wide event. No one built a house alone. Raising the frame meant lifting heavy beams, aligning joints, and relying on every able-bodied neighbor to help turn a pile of wood into something that resembled shelter. It all started with digging big holes. The main support posts needed to be buried at least 2 feet deep to keep the structure stable. These weren't clean, square excavations made by modern machines. People dug with what they had: wooden shovels, or if they were lucky, iron spades. Metal tools were rare and treasured. If someone in the village owned one, everyone borrowed it. Once the holes were dug, the first timber posts were positioned. Builders often placed large stones at the bottom of each hole to aid drainage and prevent rot. Then came the lift. 4 to 6 strong adults would heave each massive beam into place, while others guided it into the ground. It took coordination, rhythm, and trust. A wrong move could crush fingers, or worse. Try lifting a 20-foot oak log without help, and you'd end up flattened. Cooperation wasn't optional. It was survival. The real genius of medieval framing wasn't brute strength, it was the joinery. Without screws, bolts, or metal brackets, builders relied on woodworking techniques like mortise and tenon joints. One beam was cut with a rectangular hole. The connecting beam had a tongue carved to fit into it, like a puzzle piece. Fit them together, and they'd hold with surprising strength. Once aligned, wooden pegs called tree nails were hammered through the joints. Made from dried hardwoods like oak or maple, these pegs swelled when wet, locking the beams even tighter. Rain didn't weaken the house, it reinforced it. With the vertical posts in place, it was time to raise the roof beams. These massive timbers were the heaviest part of the structure and required even more manpower. 10 or more villagers would work together, using ropes and long poles to hoist each beam into position. There were no scaffolds, no harnesses, just muscle and timing. Mistakes happened. Records from old village accounts mention men who broke legs or cracked ribs when beams slipped. It was dangerous work. Everyone knew it, and everyone showed up anyway. This phase of construction cemented community bonds. Villages had unspoken rules. Help your neighbor raise their house, and they'll help raise yours. Skip out, and next time your roof caves in, no one's coming to help. These homes weren't just individual efforts. They were communal lifelines. Once the last beam was set, and the final peg driven in, something remarkable stood tall. The skeleton of a house, solid, simple, and ready to face storms. But a frame alone didn't keep out the wind. To turn timber bones into a warm, protective home, peasants had to fill in the empty spaces, one handful at a time, with the timber frame standing strong. The next task was closing the gaps, transforming a wooden skeleton into a real home. That meant building the walls. And in the medieval world, there was one go-to technique used in almost every peasant village: wattle and daub. It was messy, labor-intensive, and surprisingly effective. The first step was wattling. Builders wove flexible branches between the upright timber posts like an enormous basket. They used thin rods from hazel, willow, or young ash trees that bent without breaking. This woven lattice created a rough but sturdy surface, ready for the next layer. The structure looked primitive, but it laid the groundwork for walls that could last for generations. Then came the daub, and this is where things got dirty. Daub was a thick paste made from local materials: clay soil for body, sand to prevent cracking, straw for strength, and one essential ingredient no one liked to talk about: animal manure. Yes, cow dung held medieval houses together. The reason: it contained natural binding agents that made the mix stick, stay flexible, and resist water. Making the daub was a family affair. Everyone took part. The ingredients were dumped into a pit, mixed with water, and then stomped into the perfect texture by bare feet. Children joined in, turning it into a muddy game. It wasn't just fun, it was necessary. Proper mixing determined how strong the walls would be. Once ready, the daub was slapped onto both sides of the woven wall at the same time. Workers pressed it through the gaps, ensuring the material connected in the center. Then they smoothed the surface using wooden paddles or simply their hands. No paint rollers, no gloves. Just generations of practice. The walls took weeks to dry. Too much rain, and the daub could slump off. Too much sun, and it might crack. Patience was part of the process. Once hardened, the walls were coated in lime whitewash if the family could afford it. This thin, chalky finish helped repel insects, sealed the wall against moisture, and reflected sunlight into the dim interior. It also gave homes that classic whitewashed look often associated with older villages. When properly built and maintained, Wattle and Daub walls were surprisingly tough. Archaeological digs have uncovered sections that lasted centuries. 4 walls made from sticks, clay, and cow poop. They did the job incredibly well. With the walls finally closed in, the home had its shape, wind and animals were kept out. Privacy, however minimal, was gained. But a house still needed one last critical layer, the roof. Without it, the rain would wash everything away. And for that, peasants turned to the most traditional covering of all, thatched. Once the walls were sealed, the only thing standing between a family and the full wrath of the weather was the roof. And in most medieval villages, that meant thatch, a centuries-old roofing technique that used whatever dried plant material was available, from wheat straw to reeds pulled from nearby marshes. Simple in appearance, but layered with craftsmanship. Thatch was the peasants' answer to rain, wind, and snow. Thatched roofs weren't just thrown together. Building them required real skill, and the people who specialized in this work, thatchers, held an important place in medieval communities. Among the few trades open to common folk, becoming a thatcher took years of experience. It wasn't just about keeping dry, it was about survival. The work began with collecting mountains of material. In farming regions, straw left over from wheat harvests was ideal. In wetter areas, water reeds were more common. These reeds were tougher and lasted longer, making them a prized resource. But gathering enough to cover even one small house took weeks. Every bundle had to be dry, clean, and tied tightly. The thatcher started from the bottom edge of the roof, working upward in overlapping layers. Bundles were laid thick, around 12 to 15 inches deep. Each layer was secured using split hazel branches called swayze, bent across the bundles and fastened to the wooden frame beneath. The overlapping technique acted like scales on a fish. Each layer shed water down to the next, creating a roof that, when finished properly, was remarkably waterproof. The angle of the roof mattered. Most thatch was pitched steeply between 45 and 60 degrees to let rainwater run off quickly. Too flat, and the roof would soak through. Too steep, and the thatcher risked tumbling down. In an age without safety ropes or insurance, every roof was a tightrope walk. The finished thatch wasn't just weather-resistant, it was insulating. In winter, it held warmth, and in summer, it kept the house cooler. For such humble materials, thatch outperformed many modern expectations, but it came with risks. The biggest was fire. With open hearths burning day and night inside, and dry straw layered above, thatch was a tinderbox. A single spark could ignite the roof and turn an entire village to ash in hours. Historical records describe towns that burned completely, only to be rebuilt from scratch again and again. Over time, some communities banned thatch altogether to reduce the danger, and there were other problems too. Thatched roofs attracted guest mice, birds, bugs, even the occasional snake. They burrowed into the straw, nested, made noise, and left droppings. Peasants didn't need a rooster to wake them up. The chirping of birds in the rafters served as nature's alarm clock. Still, for all its flaws, thatch was practical. It was local, affordable, and recyclable. Old thatch was repurposed as mulch or animal bedding. Depending on the material and how well it was maintained, a roof might last anywhere from 15 to 25 years. In rare cases, well-kept water, reed thatch could stretch up to 60 years before needing replacement. With a thatched roof secured above and walls made of woven sticks and manure standing firm, the structure was finally enclosed. A home, at last warm, dry, and ready to face the changing seasons. But shelter alone wasn't enough. What happened inside those walls would define medieval life far more than any frame or roof ever could. With the roof overhead and the walls sealed, the house was finally closed off from the outside world. But inside, the real challenge began: making that shelter livable. Comfort wasn't the goal. Survival was, and for medieval families, home life meant adapting to cramped quarters, scarce resources, and a daily routine shaped by light, fire, and weather. Start with the floor. There was no tile, no wood, no stone, just dirt. The same earth outside the front door continued straight inside. At first, it was loose and soft, but after weeks of footsteps, it packed down until it became hard as rock. To improve it, peasants mixed in straw, crushed shells, sand, or even tiny stones. Some homes used a thin layer of lime to reduce dampness and harden the surface. If done right, these earthen floors could feel almost like concrete underfoot. Floors sloped gently toward one side to help with drainage. Rain, spills, and even waste could flow toward a corner and be swept out. There was no plumbing. Everything was manual. The interior walls were just the reverse side of the daub, mud-colored rough, and sometimes whitewashed if the family could afford lime. Most remained unpainted. Decoration was rare. Utility came first. Furniture was limited and entirely functional. Wooden benches lined the walls and often doubled as beds. A table might just be a wide plank balanced on trestles, taken apart when space was needed. There were no closets. Storage meant pegs in the wall, baskets, and clay-lined pits dug into the corners of the floor. Vegetables were kept cool in the ground. Tools hung from beams. Everything had to fit. The average house was about 15 by 20 feet. One room, that was it, and into that small space went 5, 6, sometimes up to 10 people, parents, children, grandparents and, during winter, even the animals, chickens, goats, maybe a pig or two. Not for fun, for warmth. The body heat of livestock helped insulate the home when the temperature dropped. Privacy didn't exist. Everyone slept in the same space, usually on raised platforms filled with straw or hay. Beds were nothing more than wide wooden shelves. Children were never told to go to your room. There wasn't one. Windows were small, if they existed at all, usually just a wooden shutter or a piece of oiled cloth or stretched parchment. These let in a bit of light while keeping the cold and wind outside. There was no glass dot. Bathing was rare. Full-body baths happened a few times a year if that. Hands and faces were washed daily using water from a stream or well, but everything else waited. Soap was expensive. Cleanliness was relative. The day revolved around the central hearth. It was the stove, the heater, and the source of light. Families cooked stews in iron pots hanging above the fire, or baked bread in clay pots buried in hot ashes. There were no utensils, just a knife and your fingers. Food was served in shared wooden bowls or on stale bread trenchers used like plates. Meals were simple, one large meal at midday, smaller ones in the morning and evening. After dark, everyone gathered near the fire to work spinning, sewing, mending tools or just to talk. Stories passed down through generations filled the smoke-filled air. Grandparents told tales, children listened. This was medieval entertainment. During winter, the house grew even more crowded. The animals came in, the door stayed shut. Everyone huddled together near the fire, wrapped in wool and blankets. One medieval account describes 8 people, 2 cows, a calf, and 6 chickens living together in a single room through a brutal January. It wasn't comfortable, but it kept them alive. Despite the smoke, the damp, the noise, and the tight quarters, these homes functioned. They held together not just with wood and clay, but with the routines, rhythms, and relationships of the families inside. And while they were simple in design, they were rich in the one thing that mattered most. Resilience. Finishing the house was only half the battle. Keeping it standing was the real test. A medieval peasant's home was never truly done. It demanded constant care, patches, repairs, reinforcements. Whether time, animals, and daily life wore everything down. Maintenance wasn't a chore, it was survival. Start with the thatched roof. It was both a blessing and a burden. Windstorms tore chunks off. Birds ripped out bundles for their nests. Rats tunneled through the layers. If the damage wasn't repaired quickly, the rain came in and ruined everything below. Locals even had sayings. Reed thatch will outlast the tenant. Straw thatch will last until the new tenant arrives. Either way, roofs needed constant attention. Walls cracked and shifted with the seasons. In dry weather, the daub dried out and split. In wet weather, it softened and slumped. Clever families whitewashed their walls, not just for cleanliness, but as a warning system. When the bright white turned brown, it was time to fix the wall before water seeped in. It wasn't just to stain, it was a signal. The floor sagged and dipped over time. New layers of packed earth had to be added to fill low spots. In wetter homes, herbs were scattered underfoot to help with the smell. Meadowsweet was a favorite not just for fragrance, but because it helped repel pests. Every step on that floor was a reminder of how temporary comfort could be. The tools for maintenance were simple. A wooden float for smoothing daub, a mallet for pounding pegs, a bone knife for trimming thatch. That was the repair kit. And the instruction manual. Ask someone older before they forget. Knowledge was passed from one calloused hand to the next. Watch, then try. That was the rule. Homes didn't last forever. Most were rebuilt from the ground up every 30 to 40 years, sometimes sooner. Excavated sites show multiple rebuilds on the same patch of land, often reusing the same foundation stones. It was easier than moving. Families stayed rooted, rebuilding again and again, generation after generation. Inside, life was always happening. A medieval peasant home was loud, crowded, and full of motion. Parents, children, grandparents, sharing the same room. Add a few animals in winter, and privacy vanished. Beds were packed with people. One child snored, another kicked, and someone always had to get up early to tend the fire. Daily life followed the daylight. At dawn, the first hint of light slipped through a cloth-covered window or the crack in a shutter. Everyone rose together. Breakfast was quick, often just bread or porridge. Then the work began. The house became a kitchen, a workshop, a barn, and a classroom, all in one. Children learned by doing. They helped gather wood, carry water, mix daub, feed animals. Girls spun wool and learned to cook. Boys practiced with tools. There were no school books, but learning was constant. Every mistake had consequences: broken beams, spoiled food, wasted time. So everyone paid attention. Baths were rare, but hands were washed. Faces, too. Full-body bathing might happen in summer, outside, in a stream or wooden tub. Soap, if it existed, was made at home and used sparingly. Clean didn't mean spotless, it meant healthy enough to keep going. Meals were shared. Around the fire, there were no separate dishes, just shared bowls and knives. The food was humble: vegetables, grains, occasional meat. Fingers did the work. Talking filled the gaps. Grandparents told stories, often the same ones. Children listened, or pretended to. After dark, the home dimmed. Tasks shifted to what could be done by firelight: mending clothes, carving spoons, spinning thread. These weren't chores, they were life. And in all of it, repairing walls, shooing mice, sharing stories, raising children. Families found meaning. These houses were far from perfect. They smoked, leaked, cracked, and creaked, but they endured. And so did the people inside them. For all their hardships, medieval homes were masterpieces of resourcefulness. Built entirely from what was available: straw, sticks, and sweat, they provided more than shelter. They held together families, they anchored communities, and they remind us that even the humblest structure can become something sacred when filled with warmth, memory, and the will to keep it standing.